Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. On today's show, I'm going to give you my start, sits, and sleepers for Week 15 of the fantasy football season. It's a crucial week of games. A lot of you are in your first week of the fantasy playoffs or the last week of your regular season, depending on how your format is set up. Either way, it's a big week of games. Last week, I went 16-10 on my picks. I'm up to 202 to 162 on the season overall. I'm 56% correct on my picks for the season. Let's have a good week this week. Let's get it going, and let's give you my quarterback starts to start the video. And it begins with Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I really think he's a must-start at this point of the season. He has taken a big step forward this year, especially lately. He is fourth overall in fantasy quarterback scoring his last 3 games. He has 20-plus fantasy points, 3 straight, and 7 of 9 games. He's been really consistent. He gets the Jets this week. They're a reeling team. They've allowed 23-plus points, 4 straight games. They even allowed 34 points last week to a so-so Dolphins offense. This Jaguars offense is much better. I think Lawrence has success in Week 15. My next start at quarterback is Jackson Dart of the New York Giants. He had at least 20 fantasy points every one of his starts before his last week played. He has been super consistent all season. He gets the Commanders this week. Much better matchup for him than his last time out when he didn't reach 20 fantasy points. This is another team that's reeling. They've allowed the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. They've allowed 300-yard passing games 3 of their last 5 games as well. I think Dart has another really good showing this week. He is the real deal, and he's going to get it done again for fantasy teams. My last start at quarterback is Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. I know many of you say he's a must-start every week. Guess what? His numbers haven't been very good the last several weeks, so some teams actually have benched him, I've seen in leagues, but I would definitely get him in my lineup this week. I thought he looked better last week. The biggest encouragement for me was the rushing yards. He had 43 rushing yards in that game last week. That was his most since week 4. He's a different player when he's running the ball. It's very encouraging when I can see him using his legs. He scored 24.25 fantasy points last week against an improving Steelers defense. Much better matchup this week against the Bengals, who've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. They've allowed at least 220 passing yards all but one game. I think Jackson has one of his better games of the season this week. Now for my sits at quarterback. It starts with Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. He's really played well much of the year, but his fantasy numbers have kind of been all over the map. He has less than 18 fantasy points, 2 straight games, and 3 of 4. He has failed to top 200 passing yards 3 of 4 games, with the Bears going to a more run-heavy approach. This has been the success of their team lately, and I think Williams could struggle to throw the ball again this week against the Browns. They've allowed just 180. They allowed just 108 passing yards last week, but 184 rushing yards to the Titans. So you could see the Bears taking advantage of that matchup. The Browns allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. My next sit at quarterback is Jacoby Brissett of the Arizona Cardinals. He's really been great since moving into the starting role. He's been usually a must-start no matter the matchup, but the Texans, this is not a team to use your fantasy players against. They are unbelievable defensively. They shut down Patrick Mahomes last week, picked him off 3 times in that game. They allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. They haven't allowed a 200-yard passing game since week 3. I'd avoid Brissett in this matchup for sure. My last sit at quarterback is Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. He failed to top 20 fantasy points in a favorable matchup last week. He has less than 20 fantasy points 3 of 4 games. He's just hard for me to trust right now, especially this week against Green Bay. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season and have allowed less than 200 passing yards 5 of 6 games. If you have better options, I would consider using them at quarterback. My sleeper at quarterback, it's J.J. McCarthy of the Minnesota Vikings. Returned to the lineup last week, scored 3 touchdowns, looked really good. He had 22.05 fantasy points in the game. That is actually his 3rd game this season with 20-plus fantasy points. So he had some big games this year, and I think you could have one this week against Dallas. Vikings are likely going to need to score some points to keep up with this Cowboys offense. Plus, the Cowboys really struggle against the pass. They allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So McCarthy could be a good spot play in this matchup. Moving on to the running back position, we'll go with the starts. And my first one is Travion Henderson of the New England Patriots. He has 11 plus fantasy points, 5 straight games, really become a very consistent fantasy back. He has more than 80 total yards all 5 of those games as well. He's really a dependable option right now, and I think he's going to get a lot of work this week against the Bills. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. They've allowed more than 180 rushing yards 5 times this year. So they've really allowed some big rushing games throughout the season. I think Henderson could get a workout in week 15. My next start is RJ Harvey of the Denver Broncos. He's really becoming a must start for me. He has 21 plus fantasy points, 2 straight games. He had a season high 23 total touches last week, including 6 receptions. That amount of work in the passing game really helps his fantasy floor. Harvey doesn't have the best matchup this week against Green Bay. They got a pretty good defense, but they've been more susceptible to the run lately. They allowed 138 rushing yards last week and 119 plus rushing yards 3 of 4 games. So I'm going with Harvey this week. I think he's going to produce well again as he's getting more and more chances in this Broncos offense. My last start at running back is Woody Marks of the Houston Texans. So 2 straight rookies make the list, and Nick Chubb's iffy to play this week. And Marks is really dominating the work at running back regardless, but he had a season-high 26 carries last week, scored 15.6 fantasy points in that game. He gets the Cardinals. They allow the 4th most fantasy points of running backs. Last week against the Rams, they allowed 249 rushing yards. I like Marks to go off in week 15. Now for my sits at running back, and it starts with Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams. Best game of the season last week. Ran 12 times for 128 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's found the end zone 2 straight games. He's becoming a little bit more of a timeshare. I still think he's more of a matchup play, though. He has double-digit carries 4 times this year and top double-digit fantasy points just 1 time in those 4 games that he's had double-digit carries. He's not a sure thing in my eyes, especially if you consider his work in the passing game. He just doesn't get any. Just 6 receptions for the entire season. I think the Lions, who they play this week, limits Corum on the ground. They allow the fewest fantasy points to running backs. I don't think he's a very good start despite his better play of late. My next sit at running back is Breece Hall of the New York Jets. Hall is just 30th overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He had just 4.3 fantasy points last week against the Dolphins, and he failed to catch a pass in that game. That's really the concern for me. He's becoming a hard player to trust in a reeling Jets offense. I don't know who's going to play quarterback for them this week. It's just not a good situation in New York. And he also gets the Jaguars. They've allowed the fewer than 100 rushing yards all but 3 games this year. So I think Hall could struggle to find much room to run in this matchup. My last sit at running back is Kamani Vidal of the Chargers. He played 69% of the snaps last week compared to 31% for Omarion Hampton, who finally returned from his injury. But I think Hampton starts to get more work this week, cuts into that playing time of Vidal. And even with that work last week, Vidal ran 14 times for just 44 yards. He had a catch for 60 yards. That really padded his fantasy stats. He's normally not very good in the passing game. So I'm worried about a regression this week against the Chiefs, who allow the 6th fewest fantasy points from running backs. They've allowed less than 85 rushing yards 3 or 4 games. I would steer clear of Vidal in this one. My sleeper at running back, it is Dylan Sampson of the Cleveland Browns. The Browns have been throwing the ball a little bit more lately, and Sampson's getting more work because of that. He's really emerged as the 3rd down back for the Browns. He played 38% of the snaps last week and had 5 catches for 64 yards on 6 targets in their attempted comeback against the Tennessee Titans. He also has double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games, so he's becoming a little more consistent for fantasy teams. I think it could be a similar scenario this week against the Bears. Could be trying to play catch-up against a good offense. Bears also struggle to stop the back and pass coverage, so I think Sampson could be an intriguing flex play for fantasy teams in Week 15. Moving on to the receiver position, we'll go with the starts, as always, to begin, and it starts with Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Waddle continues to be a bright spot for the Dolphins offense. Miami has struggled to do much lately through the air, but Waddle just keeps getting it done. He finished with 18.1 fantasy points last week in a game they threw for less than 200 yards. He has 14 plus fantasy points, 4 of 6 games. He gets the Steelers. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. So I think he's a great play once again this week in week 15. My next start at receiver is Devonta Smith of the Eagles. He's really kind of struggled lately, having fewer than double-digit fantasy points 2 straight and 3 or 4 games. But the good news for me is he's getting his chances. He has at least 8 targets, 3 straight games, 27 total targets during that stretch, those last three games. I think it's just a matter of time before he has that huge game, makes a big play in the passing game. Could be this week against the Raiders. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers, another team that's really reeling overall, and they could struggle to stop the Eagles' passing game in this one, in my opinion. My last start at receivers, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Really encouraged by last week with J.J. McCarthy back. He had 7 targets in that game with McCarthy, caught 4 passes for 62 yards. He's going to play Dallas this week, and as I mentioned earlier with McCarthy, I think they're going to need to score to keep up with that Cowboys offense. Dallas also allows the most fantasy points to receivers this year. They've really struggled to stop the pass, and I feel like Addison has a little better rapport with J.J. McCarthy than Justin Jefferson, so I'm looking for Addison to have a big game in Week 15. My sits at receiver, and the first one is Alec Pierce with the Indianapolis Colts. He's really taken his game to a new level this season, becoming more of a well-rounded receiver. But even with that said, he has endured some down games along the way. He has less than double-digit fantasy points, 4 of 11 games. There's big-time quarterback concerns with Daniel Jones getting hurt last week, out for the season. Looks like Phillip Rivers could start the game this week. That's a concern for me, especially if you consider that Rivers probably doesn't have great arm strength at this stage of his career, so he might not push the ball downfield to Pierce where he excels in the passing game. Plus, they play Seattle this week. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to receivers, have a really good defense. They've allowed fewer than 155 passing yards 2 straight in 3 of 4 games, so I'm not sure I use Pierce in the first game with Phillip Rivers as a likely starter. My next sit at receivers, Ryan Flournoy of the Dallas Cowboys. He had a monster game last week, 9 catches for 115 yards and a touchdown on 13 targets. He did not have more than 3 targets in a game since week 6 before last week, though. So I do think he's going to be more involved in the passing game going forward, but I still don't totally trust him to just have these smash games. Remember, he got a lot of work last week when CeeDee Lamb was hurt. It looks like Lamb has a good chance to play this week, so that could cut into Flournoy's playing time. I'm not buying him as a great play this week against Minnesota, who have allowed the fewest fantasy points to receivers on the season. They allowed less than 100 passing yards 2 straight games. Yes, I'm reading that right. They've allowed less than 100 passing yards, not rushing, passing yards 2 straight games. So I'm a little bit worried about Flournoy doing much in this matchup. My last sit at receivers, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. He has just been so inconsistent this year. I can't trust him at this point of the season. 2 straight games with less than 5 fantasy points. He had just a catch for negative 4 yards last week. And he gets the Browns this week. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to receivers. They've allowed less than 170 passing yards 2 straight games and 4 or 5. I think the Bears could have some struggles throwing the ball in week 15. My sleeper receiver, it's Rashid Shaheed of the Seattle Seahawks. Best game as the Seahawk last week since getting traded to them. Caught 4 passes for 67 yards on 5 targets. He also returned a punt for a touchdown. Really had a big game. I think maybe this gets him going. He gets some more looks in that Seahawks passing game. He's capable of the big game any given week because of his big playability. He gets the Colts this week. They're dealing with a lot of injuries in the secondary. They also allow the 6th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. I'm looking for Shaheed to break a big play or 2 in this matchup. Now for my tight end start, sits, and sleepers. And the starts, it begins with Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens. He's getting more looks in recent weeks. He had having 6 targets each of his last 2 games. He has double-digit fantasy points each of those last 2 games as well. He has a dream matchup against the Bengals this week. Anytime you see Cincinnati on the fantasy schedule for your tight end, you want to get your tight end in the lineup. They have been absolutely dreadful against the tight end this season. They allow the most fantasy points to tight ends, giving up 24.18 points per game to the tight end. This is almost 8 points more than the team in second place. 8 points more. They have been awful against the tight end. I think likely is a great start for fantasy teams in week 15. My next start at tight ends, Tyler Warren of the Colts. I think he's going to rebound in a big way this week. If Phillip Rivers starts, I think this is even better for him because I think Rivers might not push the ball downfield very much, as I mentioned with the Alec Pierce sit comment. I think he could look underneath to the tight end. He has a history of targeting the tight end as well. Seahawks also have struggled to stop the tight end this year, allow the third most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think Warren could end up leading the Colts passing game in targets in week 15. I like him a lot to rebound this week. Now for my sits at tight end. The first one is Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. He has at least 4 receptions, 3 straight games, and 70-plus yards, 2 straight, but he still remains more of a spot play, in my opinion, because of his production throughout the season. He's been up and down. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points, 8 of 13 games. He gets the Bills this week. They allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season. In an earlier matchup against the Bills in week 5, Hunter Henry had 2 catches for 46 yards, just 6.6 fantasy points in that game. I'm a little bit worried about him in week 15. My last sit at tight end is Oronde Gadsden. Where have you gone, Oronde Gadsden? He was unbelievable for a big stretch of games there in the middle part of the season, but he's unusable right now. He has just a catch each of his last 2 games, has not had double-digit fantasy points in a game since week 9. He gets the Kansas City Chiefs this week, who have done a good job against the fantasy tight end this year, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. You can't use Gadsden at this point of the year. My sleeper at tight end, it is Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Played 60% of the snaps last week. Darnell Washington was hurt in that game. He's likely out this week. So Freiermuth could end up being the top target at tight end for the Steelers this week. And he's had a couple of big games this year. He has 2 games with double-digit fantasy points. He's capable of the big game in this offense, in my opinion, especially this week against Miami. They're another team that has struggled to stop the tight end this year, allow the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think Freiermuth could be a sneaky play at tight end for fantasy teams. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 15 of the fantasy football season. Hope you have a lot of success this week and win these crucial set of fantasy games. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.